Mute. We are now about to go live.
Bonsoir, tout le monde.
Good evening, everyone.
Bienvenue à la deuxième
Welcome for the second session for Local Governance Orientation 2023. My name is Nathalie Dubois, and I'm a Senior Director with the Local Government and Local Governance Reform Division, and I will be hosting this evening's session.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome back for the second session for Local Governance Orientation 2023. My name is Nathalie Dubois, and I am a Senior Director with the Local Government and Local Governance Reform Division. I will be hosting this evening's session. Before we get started, I would like to go over a couple of important items. You can listen in the official language of your choice during this session. If you want to hear the audio track in English or French, you can click the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and select the language channel you wish to listen to. You also have the option to not follow a specific channel and just listen to the live feed. This session will be recorded and will be posted on the Local Governance Orientation 2023 web page, if you would like to refer to this session later. We are using a webinar format for this session. Therefore, you're unable to mute or unmute yourself or to turn your camera on or off. The Q&A function is available for you to submit your questions related to tonight's presentation. Other topic-specific questions are being monitored, and we will provide the questions and answers related to tonight's session in both official languages on our orientation website in the near future. If you are having technical issues or a weaker connection, there is an option in your registration email to call in via telephone. Alors, avant de débuter, j'aimerais partager quelques items.
So before starting, I'd like to mention a few important issues. You can listen to the session in the official language of your choice. And if you want to listen to this session in English or in French, all you have to do is click on the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and select the language channel you wish to listen to. You also have the option to not follow a specific channel and just listen to the live feed. Moreover, this session will be recorded and will be posted on the Local Governance Orientation 2023 webpage if you would like to refer to the session later on. We are using a webinar format for this session. Therefore, you are unable to mute or unmute yourselves or to turn your camera on or off. The question and answer function is available for you to submit your questions related to tonight's presentation. Other topic-specific questions are being monitored, and we will provide the questions and answers related to tonight's session in both official languages on our orientation website in the near future.
I will pause for a moment to allow you to select your preferred listening choice. Alors, vous pouvez maintenant sélectionner votre
So you
choix.
can now choose the language of your choice.
Local governance orientation is a learning opportunity for
L'orientation
and non-elected local government officials, where you will receive key information pertaining to your role in local governance and service delivery. This year's orientation will showcase 8 sessions, including tonight's, taking place throughout January and February. The session details and registration information are available on the Local Governance Orientation 2023 website. Une 9e séance en
A
présentiel.
night session in person is forecast for the spring of 2023. Other details will follow over the coming weeks.
Our agenda for tonight will feature a presentation by André Daigle, who is a lawyer who practices in the area of local government, land use planning, and procurement. André has a Master of Urban and Rural Planning and a Master of Laws with a concentration in municipal law. He is also a former city solicitor and planning and development director and city clerk. So he is very familiar with local governance issues. Tonight's presentation will provide information related to the governance and administration of local governance structures in New Brunswick, recognizing that roles differ based on the entity you represent. There may be some references during the presentation that do not apply to your role directly, but the presentation will provide insight into the different governance structures, be it local governments, rural districts, and regional service commissions, and focus on the governance and administration of these structures. Next week, the sessions will outline the specific roles and responsibilities for elected and non-elected officials of a local government and rural district. Tonight's presentation will focus on at a high level, on the different local governance structures, local governments, rural districts, and regional service commissions, and address issues that governing or advisory bodies may face during their mandate. André mettra donc en lumière les
André
points
is going to highlight the key points in governance and administration, and will point out the importance to understand the differences in the roles of the major decision counselor and the administrator.
Bienvenue, André.
Welcome, André. Thank you, Nathalie, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the session. I'm going to start by saying that it's excellent that you have opportunities to participate and to exchange your knowledge. And I'd like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to contribute this evening. And the municipalities and regional service commissions and the new entities, the communities and rural districts are very dear to me because you represent the decision makers at the local level. I find it very important that you take the time, and if you take the time, it's our turn to take the time as well to contribute and to make a small contribution, if we can, to the continuous learning opportunities. I find that when I was asked to make a presentation on this issue, we can talk about it broadly, and the question of governance and administration. But basically, I find that it is important to come back to the origins. There's a legislative context that we're going to consider. There are also questions of governance and administration that we're going to deal with afterwards. And then maybe to share a few of the challenges or things that you, without a doubt, are going to be facing during your mandate, your terms of reference. But to start with the legislative context, no, President. We have to remember that local governments or decision makers have not always existed as we see them today. During the 1970s, when equal opportunities were put in place, county governments were abolished and we replaced county governments with new municipal entities and existing entities, but we left equally a series of local service districts. And the objective at the time was to fulfill the exercise for representatives and elected people in non-incorporated areas, eventually to have representation of elected people that are on a local scale. But we have to recognize that during equal opportunities, there was so much good work being done to put in place a structure for decision-making about these services as opposed to local services. And we did what we could, but the government filled that void, and we find ourselves today with almost a total coverage of the province with elected representatives on a local basis. But I believe the minister mentioned it yesterday, that's only 5% missing, but it's quite a realization. We have elected people almost everywhere. And the local commission services have replaced the former regional service commissions in 2013. And that was another local intervener that we have to recognize, of course, in the local decision making. Next slide. So
if you look at any jurisdiction across the country, any provincial jurisdiction, you will see that each entity, each province organizes its local government in different ways. And in New Brunswick, the government has created what we see today as we have local governments, and we also have rural district advisory councils. And those are created by statute. The Local Governance Act is the piece of legislation that creates those entities, and as well as the regulations. For some of you who this is not your, I'll say it tongue in cheek, but it's not your first rodeo, of course you know this. And for those who are new, it's important to recognize that we don't exist without a piece of legislation that gives us some authority and some context for decision making. So for local governments and rural districts, that is the main piece of legislation. For regional services commissions, you have a piece of legislation on your own that's called the Regional Service Delivery Act. And there's a boundary regulation. There's a regulation as well to carry out some of the context of the act. But essentially, that is your founding piece right there. So with those two pieces of legislation, we have the audience, I believe today, that exists because those were created, because government made decisions to allow those entities to exist and to carry out some local functions. Next slide, please. So when we look at the question of governance, there's different ways to explain it. And I found that the presenters yesterday did a commendable job addressing it as well in terms of the role of the elected official versus the role of staff and different ways of interpreting it. And my add to that is that when we look at the governance aspect, I look at it from the perspective of the legislation, the governing legislation that's in place. There's a separation of powers that you will see when you start exercising your functions. The elected official has a different function than the administration. So sometimes I like to look at it from the point of view of local governments anyway have a role to play in legislation. All of the three players we talked about earlier have decisions to make, and we have advisory capacities that we undertake. For example, the rural districts, for example, will be advising the minister on local issues and decision making that needs to happen. The regional services commissions have a role as well to play with local governments. I'm not going to get into the detail of the different mandates because boy, the rural service districts have really gotten some interesting and exciting new mandates in the last little while, and I'll leave that for the other presenters that will address that later on. So when we come back to the local government, there's two ways essentially that you make decisions. And I say that in all seriousness, you either adopt bylaws or you pass resolutions. That is how your governing body makes decisions. And those are made at a special or a regular meeting of council. It might sound basic, but that is the starting point for governance decisions at the elected level. The rural districts have an advisory capacity, like I mentioned earlier, and the RSC boards provide oversight and governance relative to their mandates. One of the mandates that I'm more familiar with is the land use planning side, and there is, as I mentioned earlier, there's a structure around that that we might touch on a bit later on. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the legislative role, and this is really a local government piece, you will be asked to at some point in time to possibly pass bylaws or review existing bylaws. But the areas in which you make decisions and you steer the local government ship locally into addressing local concerns are examples here. For example, you will be dealing with water and sewer. You will be dealing with dangerous and unsightly premises, noise, parking, animals, animal control, zoning, etc. These are all areas in which the provincial government has relegated that responsibility to you to regulate and to enforce and to attribute the funds necessary as you see fit to serve the local citizens. But there will be sessions that will get into more of the details around the decision making, around the context later with other presenters. Next slide, please. Un autre chapeau que vous portez dans la gouvernance.
Another hat that you wear in governance is that you are an employer. And the reality for local governments as well as regional service commissions, so you have the hiring of administrator, of the staff, to make sure that you are able to undertake the functions. And technically, everything depends in which law you deal with. The local governance, as mentioned a while ago, functions with the Local Governance Act, and the RSCs operate with their own act. So in both situations, elected members do not undertake the employees' functions and duties. There are differences between the decision makers or those who establish the bylaws, if they are bylaws, and policies, if they're policies, and they are the elected members and the administration, which undertakes these priorities, works on these priorities. I'd like to give you a concept that you might probably see during your terms for the newly elected. And some employees are recognized according to the act. We call them statutory employees. For example, there's the treasurer and the clerk. These are two essential functions for good operation of local governments. And the goal is not to get into 100% of the details this evening, but if you see, and if you have to transact with people who have these functions, just keep in mind that they have statutory functions that are imposed on them to be responsible for the budgets and to be accountable for decision making by the government, and they have a key role to play in your operations. And even if the government, local government typically does not need to concern about the daily items, I'd like you to know that it does exist. And together, by having the role of an employer, you are also playing with a team, and every player, every civil servant and the elected members, as well as the administration, they play a key role in the local service that you're going to offer to people, or in the case of the regional service commissions in a region. So the third element that you're going to be dealing with or be exposed to as elected members and as administration, it's a cycle. It comes with the change of the leaves in the fall. It's a preparation for budgets, and transition teams have done extraordinary work basically to prepare all the budgets throughout the province. So the governments that existed who have added lands or territories, basically you've seen the budgetary was lightened, and I don't want to get into it in detail, just to expose you to the fact that in the fall, as the changing of the climate, municipalities and local governments have to prepare budgets, and you'll have to remember a variety of factors, including budgets or recommendations by regional service commissions, the other agencies with which your community transacts will propose budgets for the coming year. And I mean, Marc Melançon, I mentioned it yesterday, basically, we're managing budgets and not deficits. But these are concepts that I'd like to leave people who take care of finances to explain that better for you, but that is work in itself, and you're going to see it on an annual basis. Next slide. So when I think of the question of local governance, yes, we have to recognize that we're an entity created under an act, by statute. Yes, we have to recognize that we are an employer and we have a team that takes care of undertaking some functions. We'll get into it in a second. We have a budgetary question that we must manage. But if that was not enough, we still have to keep in mind that you're going into a notion of statutes that concern certain functions to which you're going to be exposed. The act on the Planning Act, for example, my father always asked what I did in my former life when I was urban planner. I was saying it was just zoning. I helped the people with zoning and that he could understand on that side. It might be the basic element that we were exposed to. Everything's exposed to a given time. And zoning is the tool and decision making around land use with the local level and regional level is managed by this act, falls under this act. And there are going to be representations, more detailed presentations on that side of it later on. But just listen, you might hear that act being mentioned every now and then, or issues that are going to come under your eyes so that you can make decisions either with the rezoning issues, etc. The Regional Service Delivery Act, like I mentioned a while ago, it manages not only the RSCs, but they include some municipalities in there altogether to offer shared services in planning as well as others. And the right to information and protection of the Privacy Act, that one is you're going to hear mention it here and there, but keep in mind the following. During your decision making, while you're during your meetings, when you communicate with the administration, with other colleagues, all of these documents become documents that are subject to this act. The government put in place a series of duties and obligations to document and to preserve these files. And one of the tasks that you're going to be asked to do is to decide who's going to be responsible, if it's not already done, to manage this act. Just keep in mind that it is somebody from your administration, whether it's a local government or the commission, and those people are going to guide you with this act. They're going to navigate you. And one thing that we must not forget, all these documents that you're producing, that you're distributing, are protected by an act, allow mainly to not destroy them. If you're not sure what to do with these documents, just provide them to the administration and they will take care of them in good order. And there's also the Procurement Act, mainly local governments that I've seen or dealt with, is to keep in mind that there are there's above 100,000 change every year, but if you spend money on services, you're purchasing goods, you have to follow this act in your decision making with purchases. And basically, you're exposed to this act 3 times. One is during the budgets when you're going to prepare for the following year, but during the year when you're going to go for demand for proposals, request for proposals and tenders, basically you have to authorize it and sanction the lowest offering market or the one that has the best note. But once again, we're not going into details. I just want to expose you to that so that you can swim in the language that you're going to be hearing at one time or another. The Occupational Health and Safety Act is one that imposes some obligations on you for the employer to make sure a healthy environment and without harassment for the employees. And the Motor Vehicle Act is really simply local government that's going to see to it when it comes to regulate parking, etc. You might hear that during your deliberations. If you want to modify the rules, etc. See, the Off-Road Vehicle Act, it's really the all-terrain vehicles, ATVs, and groups that want to navigate on your local roads, except from the division of provincial designation and local roads. Technically, you need a bylaw to allow them. You need the approval from the province to make them work. And I'm going to talk about budgets in the fall. Of course, there's the Municipal Capital Borrowing Act by municipalities. And when it comes to borrow during the following year for capital projects, well, you'll have to make a request to make a loan to borrow, and we have to work with the balanced budgets. And that is a way of measuring that exists as well, to make sure that we're not having deficits that are not absorbed, that are not, that come out of, go out of the local control.
Pour assurer des budgets équilibrés, bien sûr. Next slide.
Ensure balanced budgets, of course.
So we looked at the question. I looked at the question of, or presented to you the question of governance from different angles. You know, the statute, the enabling authority that you have, the question of the fact that you also carry, as elected officials, responsibility for being an employer. You look at budgets. You are exposed to a variety of other pieces of legislation that govern your affairs. Let's dive into a little more the question of the governance and administration. Next slide, please. So yesterday, both Dave and Stephen and also Mark talked about this in different ways, but I echo what they said. There is a difference between the elected official and the staff or the administration. The elected official, I see you as being accountable to the public. So, you know, I fully expect that you have your ear to the ground. You will go to the local Tim Hortons and the different you know, Knights of Columbus or the different activities that are happening locally, and your reason for being elected is because you have a knowledge of what the electorate wants, and staff is accountable to council essentially. I liked the idea yesterday of thinking through where the priorities are for government, and the way locally elected officials, I believe, cement that direction. Yes, there's bylaws that you will adopt, there's policies you will adopt, but you know, there was a suggestion yesterday, and many do it, the strategic plan. Now, this is not a piece of legislation. It's not a bylaw. It's not a policy. It's something that you will not find in the Local Governance Act. It's a way for council to set the priorities on where you want to go in the following years, and from there will flow possibly bylaw changes, possibly budgetary priorities, possibly policy changes as well. So as a government, I believe the elected official does their work well when they consider the relevant information in making decisions on policies or bylaws. It's important as well to consider the different options. Now, you're not acting as an elected official in a vacuum. You do have staff helping you through this exercise, helping you evaluate the different options and alternatives. And there's no problem. I've never seen administration want to shut the door down on the extent of the authority that a council has. For example, if a government wants to go in one direction or another, change a bylaw, change a policy or something, staff, 99 times out of 100 have always wanted to work with government and tell them, okay, this is how you do it if you want to change it, but here are the repercussions. So that discussion, even though the elected official is the final say in the policy piece, in the bylaw piece, you're working with staff to set the proper tone and make sure you're not overreaching, which leads to the next slide. Oh, I kind of covered this one. So just leave it there for a second, please. So what really is kind of recapturing what it is I mentioned earlier. As a governance piece or the governing body, the elected officers, I believe there's four things that make perfect sense. Is that you have to consider the relevant information. You have to evaluate the options. You're representing all constituents. The Local Governance Act, anyway, is written that way. And you have to eventually make decisions. Can we move to the next slide, please? Ça fait quand vous allez prendre des décisions.
So that means that when you're going to make decisions, another way to look at it, and the decisions are on the elected officials level. So check it from three angles. First of all, you have the will. And when I talk about will, it's not just the political will. Do you have the political will, and do you have confirmation from the staff that you can actually put it together and implement it if you want to go that way? The second thing that you should always keep in mind, if the administration can help you, is do you have the authority, do you have the right to pass such and such or to go that way? And the third thing that comes back during the budget is really the resources. Do you have the staff and do you have the funds to apply it? So I know that Saint-Jean at some point was following that model. So during the decision making, we would always hear the legal department, the finance department, treasury, sorry, and the municipal manager, and everybody had a different part to play in that. So money, legal, so authority and policy. Can it be implemented? Next slide, please.
Ça fait quand ça vient à l'administration.
So when it comes to administration, so we have examined the elected officials. So regarding the administration, it has different functions, and some are within the law, and some are adopted by bylaw, and some are adopted by policy. But technically, your administration should give you the context regarding decisions making, the decisions you're going to make, the options, the pros and cons related to the options that are in front of you. And it's up to them to implement the decisions. They are going to be the ones who are going to put together the team, or they're going to reroute the priorities to give out the responsibilities or priorities to the different sectors. So keep in mind, and keeping it on a high level, but technically, it's the division that I see.
À un moment donné,
it's the elected officials that makes the decisions. So at some point, you have to be able to make the decision and leave that component, leave these decisions to the administration. The public servants are going to be accountable to you. They're going to report to you. They're going to give you the successes and the challenges that come up. I have no doubt about it. And if you need any additional resources, they're going to share it. If you need to amputate a function or reduce the priority, they're going to let you know. So keep in mind that your administration team, as was mentioned earlier, includes a variety of staff. For small municipalities, sometimes we have 1, 2, or 3 hats. So to help the local government execute its priorities. But I mentioned it earlier, there are statutory public servants. Keep in mind that not only on the law on local governance, the Local Governance Act, I mentioned it, Treasury and the Clerk's Office, but we also have other officers. If you hear these terms, keep 2 things in mind. So I'm going to name them, but if you have bylaw officers or inspectors. Those are just a couple examples. People with discretionary powers in their own law. It means that when they're offering a service, when they are enforcing a bylaw, you really play a hands-off role. You are not participating in the day-to-day. You should not be taking part in the day-to-day activities as an elected official, but these people have functions that even in the administration is different because the source of their authority comes from the law or from the bylaws. So when you hear these public servants talk, you're going to understand that, okay, these people play a different part. Next slide, please.
So I find from a practical point of view, there's different ways, different metaphors that we can use. There's different examples we could use. But from a governance point of view, I find, aside from thinking of the aspects I mentioned earlier, do you have the will, the authority, and do you have the resources? I think it's important for a governance function, so the elected folks on the call, to be clear, to be there, so to be present in the dialogue when it's happening, and be decisive. At some point, the elected official needs to make a decision. Sometimes it'll take more than one meeting, but eventually that needs to happen. The administration is there to support and to execute and to report. So I find if you look at it from that point of view, it not only conceptualizes a bit of a line, the division between the governing piece and the execution piece, but it also ties back to the enabling legislation. Once government makes decisions, and you'll get into that in the following sessions, it's the administration to carry those things out. And just to give you an example of where that line can be a little blurry, and I guess this is my legal hat that I wear, and this is where I'm supposed to scare you, but I'm saying that all tongue in cheek, of course. This is it's always good to have an example of maybe where that line crosses over and what liability can attract. So, as I mentioned earlier, council shouldn't be getting involved in the daily decision making. You leave that to the administration. But here's an example: New Glasgow versus Brown. Now you might say, geez, Andre is like really on the moon here, 1907. But it's a Supreme Court of Canada decision, and sometimes case law doesn't change very much over the years. And I'm pretty sure this one here would still apply today if something happened. But if something similar happened, but it just illustrates an example of where the line was crossed. So in New Glasgow, what had happened is that the municipality had did some capital works projects on this water system, and it bought 12-inch pipes, right? So some of them were in surplus, and essentially one of the councillors took it upon themselves to sell them. Just said, listen, I'm not sure why, but I think it came from a goodwill perspective where they wanted to do some good for the municipality. But they said, look, I'll take care of it. Maybe there wasn't a lot of staff, maybe there was, and councillor just decided to be the foreman for the project. But they sold it at a loss. So 7 days after the sale, he realized that, geez, I didn't even have a motion of council to do this. And so he brought it before council to have that decision to sell it, which was already gone, approved. So essentially what happened is that the councillor became personally responsible for the difference between what it actually costs and what he sold it for. And the ratio there, so we call it a ratio, it's a fancy word to say it's a precedent, or it's a precedent setting decision. And this is the crux of what we take away, is that unless it's been authorized by council, a councillor cannot sell the goods of the municipality. So coming in afterwards and asking for forgiveness didn't cut it here, and the councillor was personally responsible for the sale of the pipes. Now, let's just be clear here. I don't expect that this happens today, but it's just an example of saying that in that case there, if the facts were a little different, and staff was responsible for selling the 12-inch pipes, you have to get authorization by council to dispose of assets for the municipality. So those are things that, from a staff perspective, instinctively, we think about, well, do we have authority to do this? If we don't have authority, let's go get it. Do we already have the authority delegated in the bylaw that we can do this? Or do we need a resolution of council? Flip this around, purchasing things. Again, did it pass in the budget last fall? Do we have the money for it? Perfect, council approved it. Staff will always be thinking, is this project ready to go ahead? Is the purchase ready to go ahead? And whether it's buying a gazebo, snowplow, or salt, we're always in the mindset of saying, okay, the money's there, the resolution's there, but we need the next step. Now we know how much we're going to buy salt, where the gazebo and where it's going to happen. We go get that resolution. It's automatic. It's an instinct. And I've been reminded many times where the perfect check and balance comes in is when it comes to the finance folks, because when it comes to paying that bill, they make sure the resolution is in place to allow the expenditure. So again, just an example or an illustration of where it makes sense to sure the capital project there was approved, but let go of the administration to the administration. OK, la prochaine diapo, s'il vous plaît.
Next slide, please.
Merci.
Thank you.
Ça fait traiter la question des grands champs de compétences en gouvernance.
So we've talked about the big fields of competence in governance. We've talked about division of governance and administration. And I think that just to mix the soup as we should, because the things are not that clear when it comes to governing, it is important to recognize that you are likely to face good discussions and good debates and eventually make good decisions that are not always easy. There are going to be challenges. And when I'm saying challenges, I'm saying it in a positive way. And I'm talking about elected officials. You are being elected to represent the people, but you are elected also to make decisions, local decisions. And sometimes there are conflicts of interest that are going to arise. There will sometimes be deontology questions that are going to arise. So you just have to recognize that if you haven't lived it yet, you are going to have situations where your colleagues that are around the table, you're going to have to manage conflict situations. There's one element. We can have a dialogue and disagree with what our colleagues are saying. This is correct. It's okay, everybody accepts it. But what happens when we're in a situation where there's a real conflict? Next slide, please. So we're going to deal with three things. I see that we skipped two decisions. I asked to change the slide, so we were going to talk about decisions, so conflicts of interest and deontology. So essentially what I recommend, especially for elected officials, is that it's really worth it to take the time to read some bylaws. Oh. So we go back one.
Moi, je vous recommande, si je peux vous faire un conseil.
So
Quand
if
ça
I
vient
can give you a piece of advice when it comes to decision making, when you are in front of the forum, I'm talking about the elected officials, but it's also the case for RSCs too. So it is worth it to review your work tools. And when I'm talking about work tools, I'm talking about policies and bylaws that frame the decisions of the council and of the staff. It could very well be the case. And of course, municipalities do have the bylaws on the deontology code or they're about to have them, but definitely the procedural bylaws, RSCs do have procedural bylaws. It's worth it to read them and to familiarize yourself with the decision making. We're going to have workshops on that later, so I'm not going to elaborate much. But please keep in mind that there's a process for decision making, there's a time for debate, and there's a time for decision making. Next slide, please.
Now, the conflicts of interest you might personally face, other members around the table, decision-making table, will likely face at some point, stem from these principles I like to refer to as fairness. It's been a long the origins of this type of legislation, or these types of words that we use today, find their roots in the principles of fairness. And when I say that, in law, before statutes, or even when statutes were in place, or when there was a void in the statute, the courts interpreted what fairness meant. So the courts interpreted how to deal with questions of conflict of interest, questions of bias, questions of trust, so trustees, questions of equity process, for example. And as governments progressed over the years, governments started to put in place and to carve out different components into the legislation. For example, I'll go from the concept of fairness to the Local Governance Act, for example, that has specific provisions in the Act on conflicts of interest. And these provisions deal with local governments and deal with local governments in a way that tells them how they have to declare the interest and how they have to account for the interest and what they must do to avoid the conflict. Those provisions for local governments are included in the Local Governance Act. The rural districts, I was informed, the LGA, well, the LGA doesn't, the Local Governance Act does not apply, but the Rural Service Commission boards, for example, have conflict of interest provisions in their regulation. It's recognized in the Act and the regulation, but the mechanics of what you have to do is in the regulation. I'm not getting into a lot of that detail, the mechanics. It'll be dealt with by other speakers. But next slide, please. It's always interesting, just like we looked at the Equal Opportunities program and the abolition of the county governments and eventually the creation of local governments and so on, the history of where the local governments came. Conflict of interest provisions that we know today really took a very important step forward in 1979. Now, the former mayor, Mr. Wheeler of Moncton, passed away. This was in 2010, but he made various very positive contributions in government throughout the years. And when he passed away, there were many flowers sent his way and many well wishes and thank yous and so on. One of the things that he was involved with, it's not nefarious, it's not bad. Okay, let me just finish the story, is that while he was mayor, there were contracts that were brought before council. And those contracts had dealings with one of the companies that he was managing. Now, he did the right thing in terms of he declared the conflict and he removed himself from the discussion. That's what we see today, essentially, that we're asked to do. But because the only pieces of legislation that existed back in 1979 were antiquated, he had to relinquish his seat eventually. When there was a conflict of interest provision back in the day, you had to look at the enabling statute to see how it is you dealt with that. And the way the Moncton Consolidated Act existed is that it stated that if nobody could hold the position of mayor if they have any interest in a contract made with the city during which they were mayor. Now, this is one example of where the legislation went to the extreme and actually disqualified eventually the mayor from holding the position, but not before the Supreme Court of Canada sent a few zingers to the Legislative Assembly. The Supreme Court of Canada mentioned that the only governing legislation we had in New Brunswick dealing with conflicts of interest dated, in this case here, the Moncton Consolidated Act, dated from 1946. So they were antiquated measures in terms of it didn't have the provisions to safeguard a person who could be a business person and also serve on council. And the Supreme Court of Canada kind of chastised the provincial government by saying everyone else, every other jurisdiction has legislation to allow business people, people who have the interest of the community at heart, and people who have a positive contribution they can make to local government, should be able to sit on council and not lose their seat when they do the right thing, which is declare it and remove themselves from the room. So the modern day legislation we see today, that you see in the Regional Service Delivery Act, in the Local Governance Act, is really thanks to this situation that presented itself with Mr. Wheeler back in 1979, where the Supreme Court of Canada gave the directive to the government to change the legislation. So you will be getting into that in more detail later on. One of the things I would like to leave you with, though, if we could go to the next slide, is that when we think of conflicts of interest, it comes from the long-standing principle that you're serving two masters at the same time. That's faux pas. You shouldn't be doing that. So this little diagram kind of shows three elements of a conflict of interest situation. First is the situation, which is either a contract or another matter that's before council. The second element is that that member has an interest on both sides of the contract. And the third thing is that it can be the same member, but it could also be somebody joined by a family association. And there's a definition for that. We won't get into 100% of the details today. Again, you'll work through these as the other facilitators provide you with some more detailed steps on how to deal with it, how to know it, how to recognize it, and what to do. I would like to go to the next one. So, une des choses que vous devez tenir à l'esprit.
So one of the things that you should keep in mind in conflicts of interest, before we go to the next slide, is that the onus is on the individual. The conflict of interest that's arising makes the individual responsible of declaring said conflict of interest. There are exceptions that make it that there is no conflict, but technically, if we are in a situation of conflict of interest, we do know it.
Résoudre un conflit d'intérêt.
The only way of solving a conflict of interest is through a complaint, and it would be settled, sadly enough, in provincial courts. And it is an approach, the heavy-handed approach that makes it that if we don't follow the stipulations, technically, we're exposed to a summary, a complaint with provincial court, in other words, summary complaint where we could lose our seats. There are exceptions for the administration with around the table, once again, that are part of administration, is that the senior official can maintain or remain in a room if he's in a conflict or if she is in a conflict, even if the council, not even if the council is aware of the conflict, the council can allow a senior member to remain on site and to give their opinion. It's the only way, but I could see it is that it once again splits up the decision maker with administration. It's a way of allowing the group entirely, the local government, to make a decision to have the best advice possible, even if there is a conflict, because the decision is not made at administration level, but it's taken at the council level. So once again, these are just major highlight. There are many more than that in the training that's going to be offered. Next slide, please. So the other situation with which you are possibly going to face is the act that says that you have to adopt a code of conduct. Code of conduct, they can call it different things, but basically it's a mandatory bylaw that requires the integration of four things: statements on values, behavior statements, which is acceptable and not acceptable, and the use of property and resources and services, and the use of communication tools and social media. That is what the Act requires. And in local governments, you have to adopt them, the code of conduct, that is. In the rural districts, you basically, if I, from what I understood, a code that was established by the department, and it is that code basically through a policy that you have to follow certain conduct behaviors and to adhere to certain values. And in the regional service commissions, RSCs, fairly often, I'm going to find that they're in your bylaws, in the procedural bylaws. And it's not a mandatory according to in your act, but it is fairly often, it's integrated within your bylaws, with your existing bylaws. Next slide, please. So the code of conduct starts with the council or the board of directors and ends with the council or your board of directors. It is a procedure mainly with local governance that we give, of course, on the elected members so that they can decide on issues of breach of code of conduct. And the elements, I don't want to go to the minor elements, but that's going to be looked at later on. But keep in mind that the code of conduct, I've seen different examples throughout the province. Some are going to allow either the board to deal with the breach of code of conduct, So to accept a complaint and to manage it, and to have a second mechanism to send it to an investigator outside, an external investigator to make a recommendation. But the decision always ends up with the council. It's not made outside. It cannot be made outside, the decision that is. Next slide, please.
So let's look at one example of a breach of conflict code of conduct. We'll use Ontario as an example, because I just feel like picking on Ontario. I'm kidding, to my Ontario friends. It is a good. It is often a good area to look for examples of some things that went well and some things that went wrong. I find in Ontario they are as litigious as I find the Americans are when it comes to really refining questions of authority. And this is one where technically, again, for a code of conduct breach, it was challenged. The mayor of Whitechurch, Stouffville, had a wall, if you will, of and you can look this up, keywords, had a wall or a hit list of the people that he wanted to fire, that he wanted to demote from certain committees, that he wanted to add, and so on. And this wall, if you will, of pictures, and you see some, it's a little tough to see, maybe he says you're fired and so on, was in the washroom. So it was in his own washroom. So when people would come in, they would actually be, some people were invited to come in and see, look, this is kind of my game plan and so on. I'm kind of elaborating because it's so easy to do, but it's a very touchy subject, because what had happened is that there was a complaint under the Code of Ethics for harassment at the workplace, and there was a complaint that the mayor tried to influence and conduct himself in a way that brought disrepute to the office of the mayor. So in Ontario, different than New Brunswick, in Ontario, you have an integrity commissioner role. And some of the larger municipalities, it's a required role. There's a history behind that, but technically it's a required role. So it's an independent officer that can come in and investigate a complaint. If you go further west, BC, the Ombudsman has that role at the municipal level. Same type of role, can come in and investigate a situation independent of the local government. Before we get too excited about that, it doesn't exist in New Brunswick, okay? Moncton is the municipality that I saw came closest to actually appointing an integrity commissioner. And instead, and it was in the public media, instead went the route of hiring a firm to look on a case-by-case basis complaints that would come in. But here, if we get back to Ontario, the integrity commissioner came in, did an investigation, and made two recommendations. The first one was that the mayor issue a formal reprimand, and that his remuneration be suspended for 30 days. The mayor decided not to comply with the wishes of council, and there was another integrity commissioner report and another council decision to escalate the consequences, which included a formal reprimand, suspending the remuneration, removal of the mayor from all memberships of committees while his term in office. Also, apart from that, no other form of communication was allowed. No other with staff. He had to return his keys, and he didn't have access to the municipal facilities except the town hall during business hours. So what is interesting about this case is that it went to the point of being challenged in court in Ontario, when municipalities make decisions like this, they adopt a bylaw. We adopt either a bylaw or a resolution, but in Ontario, you're just adopting bylaws. That's what you're doing. So it went on judicial review, and the court actually struck out 3 of those measures that were deemed to be punitive in nature. No other form of communication was struck out. Returning his keys was struck out, and no access to municipal facilities except during business hours was struck out. And what the court actually said is that you have to come back to the enabling legislation. Nowhere in the enabling legislation can you oust a member of council for a code of conduct breach. You can reprimand, you can limit, but it comes back to the statute. What are you allowed to do in the statute? So other than remuneration and reprimand and removal of committees, which is another lever that was there, they were found to be excessive in some of the measures that they undertook. The takeaway is not to say, let's see how far we can go with this. The takeaway is really to understand that the code of ethics questions start with council, finish with council. You have to find a way, however uncomfortable it might be, to deal with a complaint against possibly your fellow councillors. How do you deal with that? Whether you send it out to a third party, whether you deal with it yourself, you will have to take into consideration other factors. But how far you can go, keep in mind, we have to come back to the enabling legislation. So I believe what would be appropriate at this point, if we can go to the next slide. And that's another reference. You'll have that on your in the PowerPoint presentation that will be left with you. So the links are there. If you go to the next slide, please. So some of the highlights or the takeaways, it was not exhaustive. I recognize that. But I do appreciate that everyone on the call probably has similar experiences and could add very much to what I mentioned earlier. It's simply my contribution to some of the elements I was asked to discuss today. And for the elected officials, understand the legislative framework, I think, is important. Operate within your powers. Thank you for changing the slide. And rely on your team. For l'administration.
For administration, I believe it is important to recognize that our role, and I say it basically, and we know it, it is you're there to support your council and your board, your decision-making board. You're also there to carry out the priorities and statutory obligations, and you're there to make recommendations and to provide to the deciders the reality, the factual reality to which you're facing, so that they can take the right decisions, make the right decisions. For example.
So, tongue-in-cheek, I say this, of course. I talked about legislation. I talked about conflicts. The mayor going rogue with the bathroom wall of shame. Look, it might seem like a lot of things are happening at the same time, and it might seem like you're not sure where what direction to take. It can appear confusing for the newbies, here, but rest assured that at some point things will clear up as you get to see files, as you get to make more decisions, as your staff and you work together towards objectives, setting priorities for your region, for your locality. You will see that this road ahead will be much clearer. So Nathalie, avec ça, je vais te céder la
with
parole.
that, yeah, I'll leave you. It's up to you. Thank you very much to Deg. Thank you for having added. The sound is very low, so I don't know if it's just me, but Natalie's sound is very, very low.
We will now take a quick 5-minute break before we continue. So we'll be back in 5 minutes. Please time yourself. Merci.
Thank you.
Je m'excuse à tous. J'ai réalisé que mon micro était mal placé. We're now taking a 5-minute
Sorry for everyone.
break. And I thanked Mr. Daigle. I said his presentation was very instructive with a touch of humor, and I'm sure it was appreciated by all participants. Désolé du petit
Sorry about the small technical problem.
Welcome back, everyone. Mike is in the right place. Alors, on reprend.
So start up again. We thank you. We've received a few questions from the beginning of the presentation. So we're going to start with the first question.
Do rural districts have any input in the preparation of a budget? This will be addressed next week in the rural district session. So rest assured that these more specific questions to rural districts will be addressed in due time. Une question pour André, un peu dans
One
la
question for André in the same vein.
The rural district councils have decision-making powers. Can you unmute, s'il vous plaît?
There we go. The technological problems of the day. Maybe it's best you not hear me. But no, from a practical point of view, no. If I led you to think that rural districts have decision-making powers, no. Let's clarify that right away. Not decision-making powers when it comes to service delivery. Not decision-making powers when it comes to deciding on questions of what type of services is offered. It's a recommendation-making authority, power. As a lawyer, I always think of, well, how do you get to that recommendation? How you make a recommendation? Well, there has to be a decision. That's the way I see it. So a vote, mover, seconder, maybe, depending on the formality you're going to follow. So that's the decision I mean. That's the decision-making that has to happen at the rural districts, but it's not in terms of the service that's being offered. It's a decision to make a recommendation. I hope I didn't confuse the audience with my presentation.
No, merci, André.
No, thank you, André.
The rural district advisory councils will be elaborated on next week. Merci. Une autre
Thank you.
question.
Another question.
Given the number of amendments to the acts and amendments to amendments, which happened over the last year, will the government prepare a consolidated statute so that it is understandable? Believe me, we are as anxious as you are to get that document in our hands. On s'est fait dire qu'on devrait.
We were told that we should have this precious document, these precious documents, because there are many acts that were amended before the end of January.
Consolidated regulations should follow shortly thereafter. So I'm sure the department will send a notice when the legislation is amended or consolidated, I should say, because it's all amended, it's all in force. It's just that it has not been brought into one document to be consulted. Alors, c'est à suivre et je ne sais pas
So that's to be followed. So I don't know if everybody's seen it, but André as well is very anxious to have these documents.
Une autre question.
Another question.
Is it legal for government to require council members to sign a document forbidding them from expressing any opinion on the performance of the rural district manager or staff? This is once again a specific topic that will be addressed in more details next week. It will address, the presentation will address roles and responsibilities of the rural district advisory councils and will address the code of conduct policy and details related to the creation and legal authority to establish a policy. We will give you a few minutes for more questions. Alors, prenez le temps de taper vos questions.
Take this time to type your questions if you have any others. Another one for you, André.
Under what authority, if any, can a mayor or councillor be dismissed?
code of conflict of interest breach, where you did not disclose the interest, you did not remove yourself from the room and not participate in the discussion. The end result, as I mentioned earlier, is one of it's the hammer approach. Essentially, it is the provincial court that deals with those situations, and only a judge can oust a member of council from their position for breach of a conflict of interest. That is one element. The other one is a criminal code offense. I don't want to go down that route because you're going to think I'm just here to fearmonger, but those are the exceptions to the rule. And the third one really is come voting time.
Merci.
Thank you.
Another one. Can a mayor or councillor approve work that is above the spending limit without council's approval? For example, say there is a $3,000 spending limit, and can they then spend $10,000 and come back and ask for the difference after the work or the job is done? So that's a specific question, once again, regarding operations and policies of a local government. It will be addressed during roles and responsibilities session for local government councils, but do you have anything that you'd like to add to this, André? Because I think it's pretty specific.
Hypothetical, right?
Of course.
Thanks for the hand grenade and pulling the pin. Leave the lawyer with this one. Look, the only thing I can say is that when it comes to spending money, the treasury folks, the finance folks, and legal folks always look to some authority, some resolution. Maybe there's a general delegation in a bylaw or a budgetary item that was approved. There's always a trail somewhere that we look for to see that is permitted, but it's not in the act. It's not written in the act that way. It has to be by way of a bylaw, or it has to be by way of a policy of council. So I'd have to say, in that hypothetical situation, just like the case we saw earlier, the 1903 case, 1907. It's not a situation where asking forgiveness is a good game plan.
La prudence est de mise, donc.
So you have to be careful.
Une autre,
Another question.
souvent, la direction
Very often,
joue aussi le rôle
general
de
direction plays the role of
la
the
différence
sectors.
entre le
What is the difference between both roles? So, in a general way, the answer is found in the Act, and that has to be present at the council meeting to document the decisions and to document the closed meetings and to document the motions, and then to prepare minutes. Or so that's what the chief clerk has to for decisions for bylaws. It is a role of legislative support and decision-making role. Sometimes executive direction can benefit from the same function, and I see it often in the bylaws, for example, where we give the role to the clerk as well as to the executive director. And sometimes I see it by resolution, by way of resolution, to appoint a person for both functions or duties. My experience is that sometimes it's through practice and it's done that way, and sometimes it's through necessity. So we have a small staff, but the reality is that when you wear both hats and you're present at a meeting of the council, we always have to communicate to the council what hat we're wearing so that the council can understand if I'm giving you something as a manager or as a clerk. So is it difference in the legislative functions and in the delegation by resolution or by bylaw?
Très bien, merci.
Very well, thank you.
Another one. Do mayors and councillors fall under the authority of the New Brunswick Labor and Employment Board?
I think there's different ways of looking at that question. Maybe it could be refined a bit.
I will just have to assume what people meant. I wonder if they're considered employees in that sense. Or we could take the question under advisement, André, and
Yeah.
maybe provide a written answer with all of the intricacies that could be covered.
I think I would just like to have a follow-up to that question. If somebody could if the person who asked it could follow up, just to clarify, make sure I understand where it's coming from.
Okay.
Generally, I see an employer as a different responsibilities than an employee, right? So
Okay.
fall under.
If we don't get the follow-up required to better understand it, we'll take it under advisement and provide a written answer in the coming days.
Sure.
Okay. Est-ce que certaines municipalités ont adopté ou peuvent adopter un modèle de
Have any
gouvernance?
municipalities adopted or can they adopt a governance model? For example, Carver. So technically, the model Carver, so it's the council, the deliberating assembly, who names one public servant. And often we hear it that the council has one employee, and that employee is in charge of all operations. And it's commonly what I understand in the Carver model. So technically, it's done through a bylaw. That's the point of entry. In my opinion, it's composed of two components. So first of all, you can have a bylaw that gives functions to the executive director, but paragraph 9 of the Local Governance Act gives tasks to that agent, to that officer. So it's not done willy-nilly, but it's possible to delegate some things. But the council needs to keep in mind that once you delegate, it is delegated. If you need to change, if you want to change that, you need to change the bylaw.
Parfait, merci.
Perfect, thank you.
What, if any, act would apply if a piece of land is donated to the municipality?
So two things come to mind. The first one is it's not really donated, I guess, but when you subdivide land, there's this thing called land for public purposes. So I don't think that's what we're talking about, but that falls under the Planning Act. The way I see, if a piece of land is donated to the municipality, you have to look at the terms of which under which it was delegated. But the municipality is a corporation, can receive land, can receive goods and services like a natural person could, and has to manage that according to how it was received and how council decides to deal with that piece of land. So if just makes me think of a few other things that I would want to keep in mind if I'm going to receive land. Not me, but the local government would receive land, is that do you have a policy in place on how you manage that land? Do you need a bylaw? Not sure, depending on how big that land is, but there's different considerations. So you can receive it. The Local Governance Act as a general rule of thumb would allow you to receive land.
Merci. Are councils able to delegate the purchase or disposition of minor equipment to committees?
I have to look at, the answer is in Section 9 of the Local Governance Act. There's some things that you can delegate. That's a starting point. The other element that you have to consider, it has to be done by way of a bylaw. Some things you cannot do is you can't delegate bylaw adoption powers. You cannot delegate resolution making powers. So I'm going to say that possibly, but again, look at what you can delegate and what you cannot. So that's the due diligence exercise that has to be a follow-up to that question.
Okay. Thank you. So once again, all of these questions, even if they've been addressed with André tonight, will be provided with written answers. Une autre, you said we should familiarize ourselves with the local government's bylaws. As a new council member in an expanded district council, do we need to change our bylaws?
Instinctively, I would say that some bylaws you can eventually change them and adapt them. Zoning, for example, zoning applies to a specific area, and that one there is in place. And the Local Governance Act around sections 38, 39, 40 roughly say that you have to eventually incorporate fuse or so on the two bylaws. But I believe there was a legislative change in the late fall that actually said that you would have to go through the exercise of amending bylaws when you're annexing, when you're in fusion, when you're consolidating two local governments. I believe they need to be changed eventually, I believe. But again, somebody mentioned it earlier, there was a series of, since December 2021, there were a series of changes to the act. And I think that was the last piece, but I'm just going off what someone told me. Unfortunately, I didn't see it myself.
So once again, we will provide more in the written answers to some of these questions, because there might be some details that need to be added to the question. Je vous donne encore une minute ou deux. On a eu
So I'll give
plusieurs.
you 1 or 2 more minutes. We've had several questions. Thank you. We still have a few minutes if you have more.
And en voilà une. Where will
here's
the
one.
written answers to these questions be posted? They will be with the presentations on the orientation website, and they will be posted as soon as possible, obviously. So I think the link will be sent to you following the sessions. And by that, I mean not at the end of the full 8 sessions, but as soon as we can. As was mentioned last night, I think all of you know how to reach the department. You can send emails to your points of contact. You can reach us through the website. So please don't hesitate to send us your questions or comments following tonight's presentation. Alors, encore une fois, André, merci beaucoup d'avoir partagé.
So once again, André, thank you very much for sharing your presentation and your expertise with the participants.
As a reminder, the next session is next Wednesday night, and it will cover governance and service delivery for local governments. As you are aware, all presentations take place from 6:30 to approximately 8:30 via Zoom. Please ensure that you register ahead of time if you haven't already done so in order to get the Zoom link. Following next week's presentations, the next 4 sessions will be held every Wednesday and Friday, every Wednesday in February, sorry. We appreciate the fact that so many people are taking part in these sessions. Nous vous remercions de vous être joints à nous ce soir. Nous espérons.
Thank you for joining us tonight. We hope that you will participate in great numbers to the next session. So thank you and have a good night.
Look forward to your participation in the next sessions. Have a great night. Merci encore, André.
Merci, bonsoir.
Au
Thank
revoir.
you again, André. Thank you. Goodbye.